Hey, it's Professor Wham. It's been a month, and I finally have gotten another blog together. So, I guess this is my Halloweeny offering, and I call it My Haunted Houses. It's the little simple things that convince me. These are basically three places where I lived or visited, where I experienced odd and interesting things, but even more importantly than that, other people experienced odd and interesting things that they told me about. And in one case, there was sort of a group experience. So these are my haunted houses. Now, I've experienced distinctly unusual experiences in almost all the places I've lived. That doesn't mean that I only inhabit haunted domiciles. Most of those experiences, in fact, most of the experiences, for example, that have occurred to me in the place that I live, are because of me, not due to the location I was inhabiting. What I mean is that I believe that I help to generate or create various of my own experiences. But after eliminating myself from the equation, I can safely say that to my knowledge, I have only really either lived in or visited 3 truly haunted homes. Now, I'm not counting the house in Buck Creek Valley that I just wrote about because the house itself was fine. In fact, it was kind of a safe place. I'm also not counting the gym, which I've talked about in some places that I'm a member of currently, because the investigations there are ongoing, and it does appear to be a genuinely haunted location. Now, the places I'm talking about were and are private dwellings, and I'm going to focus not so much on my experiences, although I'll mention a few, but on what events of high or odd strangeness were reported independently by other inhabitants of the home, and the overall patterns of encounter that the collective accounts provide. The reported experiences in each dwelling also, perhaps obviously, occurred within a larger context, in which all 3 cases encompassed the living situations within and the neighborhood without. So, as I'll mention as I go on, there were things that were happening outside the home and other things that were happening inside the home that may or may not have had some bearing on what was happening. So nothing was ever standalone, as it were, but seemed to be an expression of a greater whole, of which the house itself was a part. As for the possible meanings behind these experiences, I will leave that part of the exploration open, as I'm not objective enough to determine what those might be. Now, the first example was the home my family occupied through most of the 1970s in Olathe, Kansas. We moved to this house in 1971 from Chattanooga, Tennessee, and lived as a family in it until about 1977 or 78 or so. It was a basic mid-20th century split-level house that at the time of us moving in was relatively new. Only one family had lived there prior to us, and not for long, at the north edge of town. And if you're actually watching this and not just listening to it, I was able to find a picture of the house on Google Maps, and it's right here in the middle of the screen. When I lived in it, the siding was a dark brown color, but basically it looks pretty much the same. Hasn't changed very much. And if you know anything about the style of these homes, this was a pretty standard size and style of home in the late 60s, early 70s. And this is another view. This is from Google Maps. Looking at this map, if you're actually watching, I've got the cursor right on the location of where the house was. As you can see, as I will mention here, there's a graveyard over to the left. Actually, that's to the west. The house faced north. So you have Harold Street, and this is now called East Harold Street because I believe right at the northwest corner of the graveyard it becomes West Harold Street. So when we moved in, the road was not yet paved, and there was just an open field across the street to the north. So all of this up here in the street, in this map, was basically pasture. In fact, there were horses in it. Although all of that would change quickly in the coming years. The house was just one lot away from the corner intersection, and across the road, a large city cemetery runs along the western side of the street. So that's this cemetery right here. And now lots of terrible non-paranormal things would happen in that house, including some of the worst physical abuse I experienced at the hands of my father in the eventual dissolution of my parents' marriage. For my part, I had my worst night terrors there, two of my most terrifying poltergeist experiences, and made several stupid and consequential personal decisions which took me decades to undo in this house. It was also during this time that the cattle mutilation, of which I've written about in another blog, took place just down the road a piece. So if you follow Herald Street just straight down, it goes straight out. And down about maybe 3/4 of a mile was the field that the cattle mutilation took place in that I've spoken about in another blog. There were also two very close tornadic events that barely missed the neighborhood, so lots happened in that house. When my family split up and Mom and I moved to Overland Park, Kansas on the heels of her filing for divorce, I felt nothing but relief, even though my own personal travails were not over. Despite that, being away from my father and from that house, particularly my bedroom, enabled me to begin the process of finding myself anew, away from the poisonous brand of religion that my father wielded. Now, after the divorce, my brother decided to continue living with my father, as he would have had to have changed schools and didn't want to do that. I was in high school and soon had access to my own vehicle, so was not constrained by being forced to take the bus. There was only one high school in the Olathe district at the time. It was my brother who later told me about strange things that happened in the house, particularly after my father got remarried, which was only about 6 months or so after the divorce was finalized. According to my brother, everyone living there, my father, the new wife, and himself, began to experience strange sounds, footsteps in the hallway, disembodied doors, not actual doors in the house, opening, closing, sometimes slamming shut, as well as lights turning off and on by themselves at night after everyone went to bed. There were also instances when their dog, and this dog belonged to my stepmother, was shut into certain rooms when there was no way she could have been, and she sometimes the dog acted, as if other unseen persons were in the house, barking and growling as if strangers were around. My brother also told me that for the first time in his life he found his sleep disturbed from time to time while sleeping in his room. Sometimes he had to turn a light on in order to sleep. Occasionally he actually slept in the living room on the couch rather than in his own bed. And there were times he was uncomfortable being alone in the house at night. He felt as if he were being watched. This is significant because my brother doesn't usually creep out about anything, as he is very religious and rather skeptical about ghosts and hauntings. My father believes in ghosts and reports several experiences with them over the course of his life, so he wrapped his religious views around those events. Now, these were all experiences that I had had while living there, but which, for the most part, I hadn't shared openly. I had seen shadowy figures and had observed very plain poltergeist activities, as indicated above, but had kept most of it to myself. Furthermore, I'd noticed that there was an increase in the activity after the body of an infant had been found buried in a ditch right outside the cemetery. And if you're actually looking at this, where my cursor is the approximate location of where that body was found. This had happened a year or two after our family had moved in. The body had been discovered when the city decided to begin paving the roads and dug it up as crews were excavating the shoulders to create drainage and curbs. The child appeared to have been abandoned and buried not long after birth. There was rumor of evidence that the child may have been buried alive. I just remember the smell of death lingering over the neighborhood for several days. It was tragic and creepy. Eventually, my father and his wife would move out near Paola, Kansas, so I have no idea whether subsequent owners of the house have experienced anything there. And that was just that experience. Now, the second and more dramatic experience of being in a haunted house occurred at my first spiritual teacher's townhouse in Wichita, Kansas. I met Terry Fortune, or Cat, or Caddy, as we called her, when I started performing at the Kansas City Renaissance Festival in 1981. At the time, Cat was living in a triple townhouse, 3 units joined together at the foundation, in the southwest corner of Wichita, pretty close to the city limit. The picture here I put up because it's a similar townhouse configuration to what Cat's townhouse was. Basically, you had 3 units that were together, and they shared one foundation. At the time, Cat was working as an artist at the Renaissance Festival. That's how I met her. And she was a gifted artist and a solitary practitioner of witchcraft with highly developed, although not always entirely focused, psychic abilities. As she put it, she had a tendency to attract spirits who had passed but were trapped on our plane. It was then her task to help them move on. It is safe to say that lots of strange things were always happening around her. She was also a chain smoker, a functioning alcoholic, and had an additional tendency to get into complicated romantic involvements, which is typical of functional alcoholics. While I visited her several times when she lived in the townhouse, and a number of times afterwards when she had moved to other locations, there is one particular visit I remember during which the phenomena that always seemed to be around her was literally off the scales. According to her, the phenomena had suddenly ratcheted up and had taken a more sinister turn when the bodies of 2 individuals who had been killed in one of the neighboring townhouse units, the middle of the 3, were discovered at the edge of town buried in a ditch. Strangely, like the child mentioned above, road construction had revealed them. Local reports indicated that these 2 people had been missing for months, and it was believed they had been killed in connection to drug trafficking. They had been tied up and garroted to death. Cat said that after the bodies were found, the phenomena just exploded in the house, and in fact, prior to my visit that time, I was going with a friend. She had warned us that we might experience some difficult things. For example, it was no longer possible to sleep in the basement, which I had done in the past, because the energy down there had turned oppressive, and folks that had tried to stay down there would be awakened by unseen presences poking and grabbing at them. I thought it sounded interesting, so we went and stayed the weekend. And yes, lots of things happened, including one really terrifying experience that I may share at another time. But for this, I want to stick to stuff that everyone reported or witnessed together. The most pervasive experience that everyone reported involved odd perfumed smells that seemed to focus in strange places in the house, not places where ordinarily you would smell perfumes. Cat had carefully checked, and none of the smells were anything that she could identify. No oils, perfumes, incense, or cleaners were even close to what people were experiencing. Furthermore, these smells occurred in highly localized areas and were often accompanied by a sudden blast of cold or very warm air. We also checked the ventilation system, and there was no correlation. The way I describe it is that you could be walking through the back hallway, and suddenly it was as if that smell, which was kind of floral with a hint of something musky, was thrust up one's nostrils as if from a syringe, and one would notice a chill in the air or a sudden rush of heat. And then you walked out of it. It was very odd. There were also pronounced poltergeist phenomena that everyone witnessed together, and the instance that I best remember occurred in broad daylight in the living room. Cat and her daughter Kim, who had been the focus of some of the phenomena, me and my friend, and one other person whose name I can't recall, were all present, sitting in a broad circle throughout the room. We started talking about the various things we'd all experienced, and Kat was providing a little background. She was giving us some of the details of some of the things that had been happening in some of the other townhouses. All of the two other townhouses had been affected. Kat had lit a candle taper and set it away from all of us in a holder. It was something she often did to up the vibration in a place, sort of as a kind of psychic protection. During a brief pause in the conversation, we all heard a snapping sound in the direction of the candle, so naturally we all looked over at it. We all watched as the top of the candle taper broke off and the lit upper portion began to travel across the room, picking up speed until it finally flung itself into the wall right over Kim's head. The point is that the candle fragment started out slow and then picked up speed as it progressed across the room. It wasn't as if someone had thrown it. Kim had plenty of time to duck it once it was clear the taper flame was headed her way. We all just sat there staring at this. Later that day, me and two other people witnessed a pencil that Kat had been using to take notes slowly rise in the air of its own accord and float across the room. And then it set itself down. I think it was like on a table. It wasn't flung at anyone, but then Kim was not present. By the time I witnessed these things, I'd already had my terrifying experience in the house, so these events seemed mild by comparison, but they were still unnerving. The phenomena didn't follow Kat into her next house, although the vibes there were also quite intense from time to time. In fact, none of her subsequent homes were ever as active as the townhouse was, at least not during any of my visits. I inhabited the third haunted domicile during the same time period that Bob Berdella, the Kansas City, Missouri serial killer who I knew, was arrested and his crimes made public. This haunted house and apartment, I lived on the second and third floor of a large house that had been converted into apartments, was only 2 blocks up and 1 over from Berdella's house, where the house in which he had performed his atrocities. This is a historic part of Kansas City, Missouri. It's called the Hyde Park District or the Hyde Park Neighborhood. There are actual several subsections to it. I actually found a website that centers on it, and these houses here in this picture are virtually identical to the kind of house that I lived in. These are also identical to 6 and 8 plexes. So these are fairly, in fact, Harrison, this is at 43rd and Harrison. This is very close to the house that I lived in. This should give you a sense of what the neighborhood was like. This was also the apartment in which I performed that ceremony, in which I encountered the entity energy that seemed to be connected to Bob, and which I have detailed in other places. Specifically, I've talked about it in some interviews, but I've also written an account of it in one of my short stories, in my short story book, Final Seasons, so I won't recount it here. Now, I'm pretty sure that whatever resides in that apartment has little or nothing to do with Berdella, since many of the experiences predated his arrest. So I'll only recount the things that my roommate and I both experienced, although she seems to have gotten the worst of it. The kitchen was on the 3rd floor, as was the 2nd bedroom where my roommate resided, and it was very common that I would hear someone walking upstairs and banging pans around when my roommate wasn't there. In fact, my roommate told me that the banging would occur when she was there and trying to sleep, and at first she thought I'd gotten up in the middle of the night to make something, and when she'd look out, no one was there and nothing was disturbed. Now, she and I both had cats, and fortunately, they all got along pretty well, but both of us witnessed at different times our cats seeming to play with something that led them along the floor in a chase only to disappear, at least to the cats, leaving them confused and looking around. Neither she or I could ever see anything. We never were able to figure out what they were chasing. I had a private bathroom, while my roommate used the larger master bathroom on the 2nd floor. I often kept my rooms, a bedroom, the bathroom, and an adjoining room on the second floor, shut off because my cats would romp around all night and disturb my sleep. I have a whole story about one of them giving me a black eye because they got into a fight on top of me one night. Several times I'd had the experience of sitting down on the toilet in my bathroom and feeling a small furry person, like a cat, rubbing on my leg. I'd absently reach down to pet it, thinking one of my cats had somehow gotten in, only to find that nothing was there. I found out that my roommate had had similar encounters in her bathroom. However, she had the scariest experience. One night I went to bed early because I wasn't feeling well. I knew she'd be out late. I think she was going out with some folks after work. All I remember is that I was awakened by blood-curdling screams, followed by sounds of her and another person running up and down the stairs. There was a common entrance into the building, and one entered the door to our apartment and then came up a short flight of stairs to a landing. My rooms were to the immediate right of the landing. Her part of the apartment in the kitchen was up another flight of stairs to the far left. A large living room was to the immediate left and across the landing from my rooms. Now, I got up to see what the commotion was about, and this is what she told me. She'd gotten home, came in the apartment door, and started up the stairs when she saw the figure of a man standing right outside my doors, facing her at the top of the landing. There was some light coming in the window, so she could see he appeared to be dressed in dark pants and a checkered or plaid shirt. His hair was medium length, and his face seemed to be in shadow. As soon as she saw him, he turned and seemed to walk to his right or her left toward the living room. She immediately thought that this was an intruder and that something had happened to me. She had screamed spontaneously when she saw the figure and ran back downstairs to arouse the neighbor, who was a single guy living alone. As they came back up the stairs together, they both thought they saw a figure of someone standing in the living room, and then suddenly the figure just disappeared, just kind of faded out. They both did a search around the house, upstairs on the third floor, but no one was there. By the time I was awake enough to get up, the neighbor was on his way out. He didn't know what to think of all this. I'd registered her scream as a dream initially, so it was more the commotion of them running up and down the stairs that had alerted me to something odd. Now, I have no idea if the figure came into my rooms at all, and I never saw anything like that, but I completely believe her since she isn't the kind of person to make things like that up. The one commonality between all these houses is their relative proximity to secret murder that is then discovered, even though the timing is different. It also happens to be the case that I personally had extremely scary experiences myself in each location, which I've discussed or described in other places. For me, it's the fact that others experienced odd phenomena, or that groups of us witness strange occurrences together, that renders the homes truly haunted. It's not just up to just my word, but the combined accounts of others that provides the credence needed for me. In each case, I have no idea whether the dwelling in question remained haunted after the principal observers or experiencers left. Sometimes I think that hauntings require a certain set of circumstances or people to trigger manifestation. But together I can say that these three houses helped me to conclude that there are unknown and unexplained things in the universe, enough to keep research on these topics perpetually relevant. Happy Halloween.